It's not simply a matter of thought patterns. There's a deep emotional component, a visceral, almost automatic reaction to minor triggers. For individuals with BPD, this emotional reactivity can lead to a heightened sensitivity to how they feel about themselves in any given moment, which in turn colors their reactions and relationships. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, we're going to explore the characteristics of borderline personality disorder, a condition that shares several similarities with narcissistic personality disorder. Over the next few months, I'll be sprinkling in some content that helps differentiate, I guess we'll just call it BPD from NPD, just to keep this simple. I'll try to keep away from the full name. Understanding the nuances between these two disorders is essential for anyone working in mental health or simply seeking a deeper understanding of these complex conditions. Perhaps you or someone you know is struggling with the challenges of living with or supporting someone with one of these conditions. Also, understanding the differences between BPD and NPD is crucial because they each require unique approaches to treatment and support. Misunderstanding or misdiagnosing these conditions can lead to ineffective interventions or hinder the healing process for those affected. In this episode, I'll focus specifically on BPD, borderline personality disorder, but whenever relevant, I'll contrast it with NPD so you can start to grasp the key differences between the two. By the end of the discussion, you'll have a clearer picture of how these disorders manifest and the subtle yet important distinctions that define them. A very quick disclaimer. When I use the concept BPD or NPD, I'm not necessarily referring to a diagnostic group, but rather I'm describing the characteristics and mental functioning of a group of individuals whose thinking and emotional experiences become greatly disorganized. Let's begin by examining how these individuals typically present themselves, the outward descriptive characteristics that shape their interactions and emotional expressions. Individuals struggling to manage borderline characteristics often suffer with intense and I quote, this is very critical, rapid emotional fluctuations, fear of abandonment, and unstable self-image, intense rage, and unstable relationships. Unlike NPD, where feelings of inadequacy are typically masked, individuals with borderline personality disorder openly struggle with chronic feelings of emptiness and neediness. Have you ever encountered someone whose emotional reactions seem to shift dramatically from one moment to the next? How did that affect your relationship with them? What's particularly interesting to note is that in relationships, those with NPD may seem aloof, maintaining control by keeping emotional distance, while individuals with BPD experience tumultuous relationships, where intense emotional reactions are not uncommon. I want to make one point very clear. Individuals with NPD, like BPD, do have a fragmented sense of self and therefore do rely on splitting-based defenses. However, the splitting is less evident in NPD because the tendency to project negative aspects of their own experience onto others. So in other words, it's the grandiose structure. And you may have heard me say this in prior episodes. It's one of the most important distinguishing factors between narcissism and borderline personality disorder is the narcissist has the grandiose sense of self structure. Aside from those functioning at the lower level of NPD, it's less common that the symptom presentation is one of intense neediness and clinging-like behaviors. So in other words, I'll say that slightly differently. It's very unlikely when someone is suffering with NPD, although it's possible, like in the covert or what I call the craving narcissist, but it's unlikely that you see this clinging type of behavior. More often than not, you see the grandiose structure. You see the dismissing attitude and the aloofness. To understand borderline personality disorder, let's look more closely at what is meant by, and I'm quoting here, unstable self-image. I quote it because it's such an important part of BPD. I want to start with this diagnostic indicator because an unstable self-image, I have noticed, leads to unstable relationships, impulsive behaviors, and intense mood swings, all diagnostic criteria for BPD. Why does one's self-image feel so unstable? And what does this actually look like? For those with BPD, the core of instability is often rooted in a shaky or fragmented sense of self, which makes navigating relationships feel unpredictable. Without a solid inner anchor, each interaction or perceived slight can drastically impact how they see themselves and others, creating a cycle of emotional highs and lows. Personality itself is shaped by the internalized image of self and others, our impressions, experiences, and feelings that help us relate to the world and our place in it. For those with personality disorders, however, these internalized images tend to be distorted, often intensely felt, but not accurately reflected. And I'll say more about this with the clinical example in a moment. It's not simply a matter of thought patterns. There's a deep emotional component, a visceral, almost automatic reaction to minor triggers. For individuals with BPD, this emotional reactivity can lead to a heightened sensitivity to how they feel about themselves in any given moment, which in turn colors their reactions and relationships. Let's consider an example of how this emotional reactivity might play out. Imagine a woman with BPD came in talking about how she overdrank at the bar this past weekend. And by the way, you could fill in the blank here. It doesn't have to be overdrinking. Just begin to think, so it resonates with you, any sort of excessive behavior over the weekend. In this case, it's drinking. It could be drugs. It could be promiscuity. It could be cutting. It could be hair pulling. It could be thoughts of whatever. You get the point. In this case, her drinking, she reported, upset her boyfriend, and he picked a fight with her. It got quite intense. She realized he was not the guy for her and impulsively ended the 9-month relationship. Close exploration of the overdrinking and the subsequent fight and breakup of her relationship revealed she was out on a date with her boyfriend. She took him to see a local band perform, and she was excited to introduce him to the band members following the show. He told her that he had wished that she told him this in advance, and he was not receptive to her invitation to meet the band members. To her, his comment felt deeply hurtful, and she tried to convince him of why he should participate in this meet and greet. When he refused, she grew furious with him, she reported, and could not understand why he was making such a big deal out of nothing. She did overdrink, but initially, she did not connect the overdrinking to what we came to see were her own deeper feelings of rejection. In terms of ending the relationship, she reported, I just want someone who likes what I like and is not so boring. Again, something I typically hear with these patients. especially if they're in a relationship with somebody who's drinking, for instance, and they both like to party and the other part, like their partner stops drinking, for instance. Big problem. Anyway, slowly, I was able to help her see that this seemingly minor conflict, him saying no to the meeting the band members, spiraled in her mind. She was shocked and even offended by his reaction, wondering why was he so upset over something so small. By the way, that's the word projection, which you all may be familiar with. Anyway, but beneath this frustration and complaint or attack on him was something much deeper. She wants someone who aligns completely with her interest and values, someone who would meet her emotional needs without challenge. When he falls short of that ideal, her immediate reaction is to conclude, and by the way, not think maybe, but to conclude very quickly or become convinced of this, that she needs a new boyfriend. And I emphasize that part because there's such a strong sense of conviction in that moment. So anyway, in this moment, her self-image as someone destined to be abandoned, this is what begins to surface. And her image of him as someone who can easily hurt her takes hold. So now you see, we're talking about self and other representations, how she feels about herself, that she's abandoned, and that he and other people, by the way, everybody is out to hurt her. Her surprise at his response reveals the internal disconnect. She expects others to share her views and feels bewildered when they don't, which then fuels a cycle of insecurity, betrayal, and abandonment. She cannot, however, reflect on these feelings, but instead turns to the excessive use of alcohol to make them disappear. And remember, that's the part where I told you to fill in the blank in terms of whatever resonates with you. Like I said, it could be alcohol or anything else that we could call anti-thinking. All right. The whole goal is not to think. What emerges instead, and I think you may have noticed this perhaps, and maybe you experienced this yourself, is what? What emerged? Rage. Can you recall a time when a seemingly minor event, like a comment or action, triggered a much larger emotional reaction in you or someone you know? What do you think that response might have been tied to? If we borrow a concept from mentalization-based treatment, that's known as MBT, that's an empirically based treatment that works with borderline personality disorders, and this was developed by Peter Fonagy, we can understand that individuals with BPD often show reduced capacities to mentalize. Mentalization refers to the ability to understand and interpret one's own mental states, in other words, one's own thoughts and feelings, as well as the mental states, the thoughts and feelings and behaviors of others. This skill is crucial for navigating social interactions and regulating emotions. When mentalization is impaired, it can lead to difficulties with emotional regulation and managing impulsivity. In individuals with BPD, this reduced capacity to mentalize contributes to the instability in both their relationships and their own self-image. Remember, she felt like she was someone who should just be abandoned. It can leave someone feeling really worthless, in other words. For individuals with BPD, the ability to mentalize often disappears under stress. In moments of emotional distress, particularly when triggered by actual, threatened, or even imagined loss. So I want to put emphasis on that. Imagined loss, right? Because there may not actually be a loss. But in any matter, their capacity for mentalization can be temporarily lost. But what does, and I'm quoting, loss refer to in this specific example that we're following? In this example, the loss refers to the deep emotional experience of perceived rejection and abandonment. When her boyfriend declined her invitation to meet the band members, it triggered her feelings of emotional vulnerability. To her, the response felt like a personal rejection, signaling a threat to the connection and security she sought in the relationship. Her internal experience of loss was not just about the event itself, but about the fear of being abandoned or unimportant to someone she cared about. This triggered her emotional dysregulation, which made it difficult for her to process or understand the situation in a more rational way. Instead, she reacted with, again, you know it, anger, frustration, and impulsivity, rooted in a deeper fear of emotional abandonment. This is the moment when her capacity to mentalize, recognize, and reflect on the mental states of both herself and her boyfriend completely breaks down. If we pivot for just a moment, I like to offer you another way to conceptualize what happened here. And then we'll bring everything together to explore interventions and strategies that can be helpful to someone in this situation. So here's the alternative conceptualization. From the perspective of her ego, this instability and emotional reactivity can be understood as what's known as, and I'm quoting, ego weakness. Her ego has difficulty holding up a consistent sense of self, and when met with the emotional, and I'm quoting here, flooding, right? She was flooded. This was triggered by, even a mild perceived rejection or a criticism. In other words, a minor criticism or rejection. This could even sometimes be a different opinion. Because the ego is compromised, it gets flooded. This isn't simply a frail sense of self-image. That's part of it. But what I'm suggesting, rather, it's the way her ego functions, often relying on lower level, which just basically means not as effective, defense mechanisms, such as splitting, projection, and denial. So let me say that in a different way, just so I'm very clear. When one has these, what we call ego weaknesses, not only is the ego not able to protect itself from being flooded by emotions, but it also relies on more primitive level defenses. And I don't mean primitive in a pejorative way, but these are defenses, the splitting, projection, projective identification, denial, etc., that these defenses distort reality. And they tend to keep her image of herself and others divided into good and bad, making it hard for her to integrate both positive and negative views of herself and others. When her defenses are dominated by splitting, it becomes nearly impossible for her to process or, and I'm quoting this, neutralize feelings of aggression and turn them into everyday disappointment. So there's one of the biggest characteristics, again, with the borderline personality disorder, is they do not experience disappointment, everyday disappointment. Instead, they get overwhelmed, and they're overwhelmed with what? This anger. And that's the intense anger that then manifests, and this is what you see. Without this integration, the aggression remains unchecked and directed inwardly. That could be the cutting, for instance, or the over drinking, or outwardly, leaving her stuck with these intense, unresolved emotions. Instead of being able to see her boyfriend's comment as neutral or minor, she experienced it as a threat to her sense of self, intensifying her reaction. Because of her weakened ego and reliance on reality-distorting defense mechanisms, again, such as splitting, projection, projective identification, denial, etc., her capacity for tolerating anxiety and controlling her impulses is limited. And impulsive behaviors is one of the defining traits of borderline personality disorders. Ultimately, this lack of ego strength interferes with her ability to form a cohesive self-image, and it impedes her capacity for self-individuation, making her deeply dependent on how others view and interact with her. And again, if you remember, earlier I mentioned that unstable relations are also one of the defining traits of borderline personality disorder. So some of this, what I'm suggesting to you, and because I'm always thinking about interventions or treatment or relating to somebody like this in your life, emanates from the weak ego. So that begins to tell us we need to help this kind of individual strengthen or shore up their ego capacities. Anyway, in contrast, someone with narcissistic personality disorder might respond to the boyfriend's refusal to meet the band by distancing themselves emotionally or dismissing the other person's perspective to protect their sense of superiority and control. Rather than experiencing an internal flooding of intense emotions, they may rely on the grandiose structure and devaluation of the boyfriend to maintain their self-esteem and their self-image. See, so you could see the very different responses. So there is a bit more stability, in other words, with NPD because of the grandiose structure. It allows them to keep others and their own painful feelings at an emotional distance, avoiding the vulnerability and the flooding effect that someone with BPD might feel, as I described in this example. So they're not as frequently overwhelmed. In other words, and they both split. Remember, I mentioned that before because they both have a fragmented sense of self. But again, one of the differentiating factors is with BPD, you see this splitting far more frequently or intensely, right? So because people with narcissism have the grandiose structure, it's like a patch that's able to help them keep their self-esteem and self-image relatively stable, albeit false. Of course, we know that, especially if you listen to any of the prior episodes. It's a false self, but it's a more stable self as compared to the self of somebody with borderline personality disorder, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's think about how to strengthen that ego. Emotional validation is a bridge to self-regulation. In emotionally charged moments, validating feelings can play a pivotal role in helping individuals with BPD stabilize. Take, for instance, this situation where her emotional reaction reveals the difficulties of self-regulation. The moment her boyfriend doesn't match her level of enthusiasm, her emotional balance unravels. In terms of relating to someone like this, validating the disappointment is key here. It may look something like this. That must have felt very upsetting. You were hoping for his full attention, his full participation, or full enthusiasm. Again, depending on what situation you put in this, right? Remember I said, whatever resonates with you. But the main point here is you validate what she was looking for and what she actually received. But he couldn't give you that, which must have felt so disappointing. This validation acknowledges her feelings and helps her begin the process of self-regulation, even if she hasn't yet developed the internal stability to manage it independently. In other words, I'm kind of like loaning my ego to her, right? I'm helping her with this. This is a tool or technique that I frequently use with these patients when they present in this dysregulated state. The initial aim is to help stabilize emotional expression, without which there can be no serious consideration of internal representations, those things that I mentioned before, of her as being taken advantage of, or being abandoned, I should say. Well, it's both. Anyway, over many prior episodes, you've heard me talk about appreciating your loved one's subjective experience, which on the surface seems simple, but I can't emphasize enough the power of this initial validation. Exploring everyday conflicts like this one demonstrates that you have the patience and interest in taking the time to identify differences in perspectives. You are also legitimizing and accepting their different perspective, such as, that must have felt very upsetting. While doing this, I'm always assessing, trying to understand, and then developing one's mentalizing capacities. In this example, she was not initially in touch with her own deeper feelings of a rejection, remember? At the same time, she was also unable to consider or take any responsibility for understanding his mental processes or why he may not have wanted to meet the band. The goal, again, very much in line with mentalization-based treatment, is to facilitate an environment of curiosity, thought, and contemplation, to think about both one's own, her assumption of rejection and abandonment, and one's partner's mental states. This approach reflects my work with these individuals, where I guide patients to develop a balanced awareness of their own inner experiences while also making room to understand those of others. Do you think understanding your own or another person's emotional experience can help you stabilize your own emotions when in conflict? So to pull all this together for now, I would say both distorted representations, images of oneself and others, plus the ego weaknesses that I detailed previously, both play a crucial role in how individuals with BPD experience and react to the world around them. In other words, they both have to be taken into consideration, as do other factors as well, which I mentioned earlier I will sprinkle in over the next couple of months. We have to keep in mind that these distorted views, they shift rapidly based on one's own emotional experiences, making it very difficult for these individuals to hold on to a stable sense of self or others. That's the splitting, by the way. And that's being overwhelmed with affect, again, because of the weakened ego. When coupled with ego weakness, which I just mentioned, this leaves them unstable or unable to self-soothe or integrate complex feelings. And then they're left highly vulnerable to emotional, that's the flooding, right? Where minor disappointments or perceived rejections trigger intense emotional reactions. If you or someone you know is experiencing intense emotional reactions like the ones I'm describing, working with a trained and experienced psychodynamic psychotherapist can be incredibly helpful. In my practice, I specialize in helping individuals navigate and transform these challenging dynamics, fostering more stable ways of thinking about oneself and relating to others. As always, there's still so much more to say. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll continue to dive deeper into these dynamics with BPD and MPD in future episodes. But at the very least, I hope this discussion has offered you a lens through which to differentiate between the emotional flooding and instability of BPD and the distancing mechanisms often seen in narcissistic personality disorder. As always, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding anything that I covered today. If you want to learn more about narcissistic characteristics, please subscribe to this podcast. If you want to do an even deeper dive into all issues related to personality disorders, I'm very pleased to announce that I just released a continuing education seminar series, which can be accessed through my website, linked below. Okay, until next time, engage your mentalizing mind. All right, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.